thank you so much for being here with me today. We're going to have a conversation about identity, the feeling of being in between, growing roots, and moving across the ocean multiple times for you. So let's start with, who you are, how you grew up, so we can give context to this conversation. So what can you share about your childhood?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me, Nat. It's always a pleasure to see you. So, yeah, my name is Nick Thompson, and I am a creative leader within now technology. But my career has spanned all sorts of different disciplines, starting from fine art publishing to new media to writing. And there's always been this consistent through line of what I would describe as curation and taste around my work. And, I think right now, especially in the age of AI, there's a lot of conversations about taste and how taste is a uniquely human thing. And a lot of people seem to think you either have it or you don't. I would fundamentally reject that notion, however, simply because if you look at my background, my upbringing, you would see that I do not come from a place where there's any sort of taste or background. I come from a very small rural town in the United States in the desert of the Southwest. And it's, very traditional blue collar, hardworking individuals, huge mining community, actually. But I don't think that anybody that's ever been to my hometown would ever describe it as a place that's at the forefront of taste by any means. But for me, growing up there, I'm a first generation American, so I was born to an immigrant family, and always kind of felt a stronger connection to my cultural heritage as opposed to simply where I happen to have been born. So through having that, I just had this natural curiosity about the world, even from a really young age. I remember as like a 5-year-old running around telling everybody, "Oh yeah, I'm going to move to Europe when I'm older, or I'm going to move to Asia, or I'm going to move to the Middle East, or wherever it might have been." And that curiosity is just something that I think has really opened up a lot of doors for me throughout my entire life. I've always remained naturally curious. I still am. That's perhaps the journalist in me where I like to call myself naturally nosy. But that curiosity, I think, has really helped me to develop a unique perspective, a unique point of view that a lot of other people don't necessarily have. And if people today, I lead a pretty large global team at my current place of work, and if people are asking me, "Oh, how do I get really well versed on a certain subject or a certain topic?" My general answer to them is just be really curious, lean in, do research. I think taste is really something that's developed over time through repetition. It's a muscle that we can all build and flex.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. But I do want to ask you more about your small town and your cultural heritage. You say that you always found more influence in where your family was from. Can you share where they're from and what that influence meant to you as a kid? And, also how it led you to just realize that your path might look different.
Yeah. So my grandfather was a U.S. service member, and he grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania. He was born before the Second World War, and um, was stationed in Korea. He was stationed in South Africa, and eventually he made his way to the Seychelles, which a lot of people, if you know it at all, you're going to think of probably the British royal family going on their honeymoons there. But for those who don't know where the Seychelles are or what they are, it's a small group of islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean, the closest landmass being Madagascar. And the culture there, it was kind of right in the middle of a trade route throughout history. It's passed hands through the French, through the British. It's now part of the Commonwealth. The culture there is really, it's a Creole based culture, meaning it's a blend of a lot of different cultures. So the cuisine that I grew up eating was very vibrant, spicy curries, or lots of tropical fruit salads and whole fish, which in a small desert town is, as you might imagine, not particularly common. which I think also brings me to, how my family even ended up there. So after my grandparents met in the Seychelles, first they actually went to Iran, where my mother was born, and they lived there pretty much up until the Iranian Revolution in the late 70s. Then spent a couple of years in Saudi Arabia before finally moving back to the United States. And the town that I grew up in used to have an Air Force base in it. So that Air Force base was open until the 1990s. So there was a really large community of folks who had moved there because of the base, really. So that's eventually what took my family there. The base has long since closed, and my family no longer lives there, with the exception of my grandmother. But so I grew up in this, really odd place for somebody who grew up speaking Creole French, being in a Creole island culture. And in a sense, it was almost like I was growing up on an island as well. I grew up in a really remote place in the Mojave Desert of Southern California that is physically isolated from a lot of the world. To get into the broader Los Angeles basin, you have to cross a mountain range. The next biggest city, aside from LA, is Las Vegas, which is over a 3-hour drive. There is almost an island or an islander mentality there as well, in that, I think people feel that sense of cultural isolation. They're not really here nor there. And that had also, I think, a really big influence on sort of my state of mind and my mindset growing up as a kid. And because I was growing up with an islander mentality, but a different islander mentality in this sort of cultural island, if you will, I really always kind of felt like, this isn't really where I fit in. It's not really where I belong. I wanted to go see the world. I spoke different languages. I, was again, really curious as a child. But the people that I grew up around were largely people that were very content with the idea of spending their entire lives in the same place and not really venturing outside of their comfort zone. In fact, I know a lot of people that I went to high school with, as an example, who have never left the state of California, let alone the country. So yeah, it was just a really unique upbringing. And if I look at how my life has developed over the years versus where I came from, it's really, really a drastic difference. With that being said, though, if you look at my family who moved across continents, across oceans multiple times, I suppose it's not all that surprising that I was going to lead a similar path in my life.
Yeah. I mean, based on this context, what made you want to leave and then eventually leave? What were you looking for, and how did you even make it? Because the way I understand this right now, it's not easy for people from this kind of towns to leave. And I think right now I can even just think about so many people who live in a small town, or who think that that's it, who think that that's their path and their destiny, and they cannot go anywhere. So I just want to understand, and try to see if this conversation can help people who feel this way, who feel like they don't belong. What can they do, or what did you do to just leave and take that leap? Because it was not easy, right?
Um, it was and it wasn't. I think it was easy insofar that I knew it was going to happen. I had this self-determination that, this was something that I was going to do, regardless of whatever roadblocks there were going to be. And I grew up in an age that, this was before social media. We still had dial-up internet. Google Translate wasn't even a thing. And I think especially for people who are growing up today, right? There's so many tools available. There's so much knowledge that can be sourced through social media platforms, through the internet, heck, even through AI these days. None of that existed back then.
But yet they still feel like they can't leave.
That's sort of this tribal mentality, right? Let's dial back to, let's say when people were living in caves. To leave your tribe, that was pretty much a death sentence. It wasn't something that most people were comfortable with doing. And that was literally because it was a matter of life or death. But I also think that's something in our current society, if you look at, let's say, indigenous cultures, right, all over the world, most of them have some sort of initiatory tradition that both young men and women have to go through at some point. And for many of these people, it's this idea, or for many of these cultures, rather, it's this idea of passing through a threshold. It's a figurative sort of death. You are leaving behind the child, the small boy, the young girl, and coming into yourself as an adult. And this process, this initiatory practice, is oftentimes viewed as a trial of sorts. It is something that actually pushes you to a limit. If you take the Spartans as an example, they used to send their young boys to a mountain for, I forget if it was 30 days or something like that, but they were meant to fend for themselves in the wild for this period of time. We don't really have practices like that today, at least not in the traditional sense. And I think it's really on us as individuals to look for opportunities to challenge ourselves. And I recognize not everybody who's born in a small town and kind of feels like an outsider there is necessarily going to hop on a plane and move across to the other side of the world. But even the idea of moving outside of your hometown, or taking a risk and starting a business on your own, or maybe it's just even adopting a hobby that you didn't know was something that you could be passionate about and becoming really passionate about it. These are all different areas of opportunity that I think if we were really to dial it down, this is how you can grow and develop and push yourself. And I think through that, I like to think of growth always being something that you have to choose. And you have to choose that oftentimes at the expense of being comfortable. And I think, to your point earlier, this sort of idea, oh, how can I even get out of here? Well, it's because people keep on choosing what's comfortable. And I get it. I think we've all done that and we're all guilty of it at times. But if you really want to grow and develop and seek new opportunities, then you have to proactively choose that growth path. We don't live in a society that gives it to us in that regard anymore. Even if you think about the traditional education systems, I mean, universities are really struggling right now because they're struggling to stay relevant and keep up in this new day and age, where technological advancements are moving at a breakneck pace. So if we really want to choose that growth and comfort, it's not by sticking to the systems that are in place today. It's, again, by going outside of our comfort zones, by challenging ourselves to seek out new and unique experiences that aren't currently available to us.
Yeah, I agree, and I think we could do an entire episode just about this topic. Um, but let's go back to where you went when you decided to leave. I'm also curious because of what you just said, how you're supported by your entourage as well. And I'm just also curious what made you leave, where you went, but also how did your parents support you?
I think the story that was really sort of I guess, the catalyst for me deciding to leave was, we had a neighbor growing up who, it was a German guy and his wife. His wife was American, and they would always host foreign exchange students from Germany in, my small little hometown. So they were very, very close with my family. They would come over for dinner a lot at my grandmother's house. She was kind of a big, neighborhood entertainer, if you will. And so they had brought one of their exchange students with them. And I must have been maybe 8 or 9 years old at the time. And I was so fascinated by this idea of, what, I can go to a different country and go to school there. How cool is that? And it was quite interesting because the particular individual that was an exchange student, with this family, he was a little arrogant, if I'm going to be honest, because when I said, "Oh, I want to do something just like that when I'm older," he actually came back and said, "No, Americans aren't smart enough to do that." I mean, I remember just thinking to myself, I thought, well, I'm going to prove you wrong. So sure enough, a couple of years went by and went into high school, and I, at the time, started looking into programs and, hey, how can I do this? Like, I really do want to go to Europe. I want to see something new. And so I applied to different scholarships and grant programs and ended up being selected through a program basically to go to school in Germany. So I did end up going, and I ended up in Bonn, Germany. And my parents were, I guess, lukewarm at best to the idea, if I'm being honest with you. And I understand it from a parental perspective. it's always hard to let your kids go out and venture into the big wide world. But, ultimately they said, okay, well, this is your decision. And as long as you continue to get good grades and, you ensure that you graduate high school, then, yeah, we're supportive of this. So I went to Europe, ended up with a really wonderful family in the city of Bonn, Germany. And I loved that experience so much because, obviously I had grown up in a place that I didn't ever really feel like I was completely part of that community. And boy, was I in for a rude awakening when I got to Germany, because I moved there without even knowing how to speak the language. And for those of you who know how difficult German is as a language, I mean, it's makes English look like a cakewalk, right? So I get there and I was really, really determined. Hey, I'm gonna learn this language. And I remember telling my host parents, please don't ever speak in English to me. We'll figure it out. We had this little paper dictionary at the time that we would keep at the dinner table with us. And if there was a word that was said that I didn't know, we'd look it up, because again, we didn't have smartphones back then. So it took me about 6 months to fully start understanding what was happening in the world around me. But during that experience as well, what I thought was so unique about it was that it took me outside, right? I wasn't really in the society itself. So I was able to observe in ways that I don't think I've ever been able to do ever since, simply because I was forced to really analyze everything that I wanted to say and everything that everybody else was saying. It was a tremendous effort for me to even articulate basic needs and wants in this language that I didn't have a firm grasp of. So I had to turn every phrase over one by one and think about, okay, is this actually something that I need to even say or not? And that was such a transformative experience for me that I, then determined, well, I'm not going to stay in Southern California. This is just not an option for me. So I made it a priority to come back to Europe to go to university, and did just that. And yeah, the rest is kind of history, in all honesty.
I mean, I met you in Germany over 10 years ago. When I met you, we were working in the same office in the same publishing company, and all our coworkers were Germans. And I just would hear you speak German every day. And it took me a couple of days to realize that you're not German. And I was really shocked when I realized that you're American, because my family is not too far from your family in Southern California. So this is also how we bonded. But I mean, your German is perfect. And it's really, I mean, I'm ashamed. I lived in Germany for a long time and I'm not even close to speaking German the way you do. But yeah, Germany became a huge part of your story. Do you want to give me a bit of a snapshot of your life in Germany since and towards your career? Also, just talking about the work in the creative field, as we mentioned, publishing, luxury hotels, and yeah, that life in Germany.
Yeah, Germany was and is to date the biggest chapter of my life thus far. I spent a total of 13 years there, and have many, many friends. In fact, most of my closest friends are still in Germany. My partner is German. It's a huge chapter of my life. And so I actually started a university in southern Germany, and I was in a program that ultimately wasn't really what I was looking for. So I actually finished up school in the Netherlands, and then right out of university, I was thinking to myself, okay, well, I have no idea what I want to do with my life. Where do I even begin? Um, and at the time, I had some friends out in Berlin, which is where you and I ultimately would cross paths, but. So I just reached out to my network and said, "Hey, I'm just looking for opportunities to do internships or trainee programs or something like that, just to get my feet wet and understand, what's out there." I studied European politics and history, and realized pretty quickly while I was in university that I didn't want to become a politician or a bureaucrat. So yeah, I ended up coming across an opportunity through a company called Design Hotels, and they are headquartered in Berlin. So I ended up joining their creative team, and at the time, and they still do this to my knowledge, but Design Hotels has a really big publishing arm. So they publish a regular magazine, they publish an annual book. And, for me, this young kid coming from small town USA, this idea of working for a big company that is building some of the most beautiful hotels out in the world and have such an inspiring and vibrant creative community, it just seemed like an awesome opportunity. So I leapt at it. And it was there that I actually really started to own my skills as a writer. My boss at the time, she had formerly worked for Martha Stewart Living. And again, this was all pre-smartphone days, pre-AI. So we would have to print everything out that we would write, and we'd put it on her desk, and she'd correct it with a red pen. And all the writers, we'd all say, "Oh, how bloodied up are you today?" Because depending on how she edited your piece, and in many ways, she was ruthless. But I really think that what she did for me at that age, that was the best experience I could have possibly had. And I've since had the pleasure and the honor of mentoring young colleagues ever since. And I just think, the way that corporate culture is today, you wouldn't be able to operate in that same way, right? Um, this was I remember one time, for example, I got scolded for checking a text message on my phone during work hours. This isn't something that you would get away with today, certainly not in the world of remote work. And I'm not a proponent necessarily of all those levels of strictness, but when it came to writing, I was so appreciative of having this very skilled editor who would come in and say, "This belongs here and this doesn't." And I think that's another huge part of taste, right? And I think this is why today, like, editors are doing so well in the world, because we have this way of determining that something is worth mentioning or worth having in the world as opposed to not. And that's really a skill that's becoming more and more invaluable when we're thinking about things like slop, I think, or there's another word that I think I taught you a couple of weeks ago that I don't know if this is
I
appropriate
love
for
it.
the podcast,
Yes,
but
it is. Let's say it.
well,
Just say it.
so
I love this word.
yeah, I mean, I
No,
love,
because it really defines it really gives a word to a lot of the feelings right now. So let's go for it. Let's talk about this.
yeah. So there's this whole concept of what I like to call enshittification. And, it's basically just everything around us is just turning into slop or low quality garbage. And, be it uncanny valley when you're looking at a social media feed of AI altered faces to artwork where you're thinking to yourself, this is just not good. It's hard to articulate what's wrong with it, but you can see it, and your eyes are just trained to realize that, hey, this is not good, right? So I think that's actually a good segue into, while I was at Design Hotels, I ended up meeting somebody who is both near and dear to the two of us, who would eventually become a professional mentor to me, who at the time,
And to
yeah, hand to you. So shout out to Martin if you're
yeah.
listening. But so I came across this guy who was working for a big publishing house, and he was an investor at Design Hotels, so that's how he ended up becoming acquainted with some of my writing. And he took to my ability and said, "Hey, do you want to come and work for us here?" So that's how I ended up joining this publishing house where the two of us met. And that was also a deep dive into not just hospitality and hotels, but then that expanded to, we were doing these travel guides for different cities around the world. So that expanded into restaurants, into galleries, into shops. And then we would also do all sorts of different fine art coffee table books, just in general around taste, right? Everything that we were doing was so taste driven.
Hotels, architecture, design, restaurants, recipe book.
Yeah.
We did a lot. I do agree that I think we went to one of the best schools to define what good taste is. I'm so glad we did that before social media. Unfortunately, a lot of the books we created at the time had digital features that were too early.
Yeah.
for this world, unfortunately, because I think we created some of the most beautiful books I've ever seen, but we didn't make it to to, to this era.
It's funny though, because I still go into, random design stores or like nice restaurants or hotel lobbies, and I see our books everywhere. And there's always a sense of pride, definitely. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, I was at a really high-end wine shop, and they had luxury toys for boys in there. And I had to
Oh,
think of you
hard work.
immediately. Yeah.
Yeah. That's so nice. But let's refocus on you because I think you and I can have so many conversation about just taste and design and publishing and but I really want to focus on your story because I do believe it's incredibly inspiring and I want to ask you about your identity at this stage because, you grew up in that small town in California. You did move as a teenager to Germany and had to learn everything and be this observer of, just thinking twice before speaking, which I think is a very crucial part to education, right? To just not say everything and just really think. And then all of a sudden you're thrown into this, let's say it is a glamorous world. It was a glamorous world at the time, this whole publishing and being in all these events and hotels and, being with architects and designers. And I really want to ask you about what it did to your identity at the time. How did you feel? Did you still feel like that small boy from the small town who didn't belong, or did you feel different? I mean, I just want to try and understand your mindset at the time. You were, I guess, in your mid-20s, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's a really great question. So I think there's a couple of different ways that I can answer this. One is that, that identity component of this small town boy. I don't know that I ever actually had that as an identity marker. Like I never considered myself to be that person. So it was really easy for me to disassociate from that, right? And only I think later in life, in the past couple of years, have I actually come to understand how that influenced me. But I think at the time, the world of luxury and this sort of glamorous lifestyle, as you're talking about, it's really easy to get caught up in that, right? Especially when you're at an impressionable age, when you're in your early 20s. And I remember just so badly wanting to fit into that crowd. It just seemed everybody seemed so cool and worldly and interesting. And, so I actually ended up kind of getting, I don't know that I would say in trouble, but, we were living in Berlin. Berlin, certainly at the time was in its heyday of hedonism. And I totally took advantage of it, right? At that point in time in my life as well, my body was much more forgiving than it is today. And, I think I loved it, but then there was also a part of me that kind of just felt like, oh, I'm starting to run on exhaust fumes, and I don't know how much longer I have, that I can do this, that I can live this way. And it was kind of serendipitous in a sense that I ended up having a health issue that actually made me take a step back from my career and really think about the life that I was living and think about, which direction I wanted to go in from there. And, I think taking that step back, for me at that point in time, right, it was involuntary. My body was making me do it, but it was also super informative in a sense because it really gave me the space and the ability to think about the life that I was living and whether or not it was aligned with what my values are and with the direction that I wanted to go. I think, after our time in publishing, I ended up going more into the advertising creative direction route. So not only was I continuing to live this lifestyle that, the creative class and everything, I think that's kind of how folks were referring to it back then. But for anybody that's worked in advertising, you'll know that the hours are brutal. And all of those things compounded together for me to eventually come to this realization that, hey, I'm doing things that aren't actually aligned with my values, with the direction that I want to take my life in. And, to a certain degree as well, living for somebody else's dream is effectively what I felt like I was doing. So, I had to take a step back from my career and I took things a little bit more easy. I just ended up doing more freelance work. And that actually then ended up coinciding with another move, and this time back to the US. So my better half ended up getting a job in San Francisco. And we thought, you know what? Hey, this is a great opportunity for both of us to continue building our careers. And, I was in my late 20s at the time, so still pretty young, I would say. And so we took the leap across the ocean. And, San Francisco is this city that's, I call it kind of a bang or bust city. And, I'd actually say right now it's on the rise again. But, certainly during COVID, a lot of people said that, oh, San Francisco is over. But there's this energy there, this sort of altruism, for better or for worse, that what everybody is doing is contributing to the greater good of the world. And I certainly won't deny that there's so much innovation and drive coming out of the San Francisco Bay Area. But, that also comes at a cost of, it's one of the highest costs of living in the world. Um, and, me being a measly little freelance writer at the time, that just wasn't affording me, not even the lifestyle, I won't even go into that, but more just, even just basic creature comforts at that time. I ended up having to say again, okay, you know what, I need to pivot. I've given my body some time to recover from health issues. Now it's time to buckle down again and pursue career. And so that's how I ended up in tech, which is where I am today. And there's a lot of great things that have come out of this chapter of my life, and there's certainly a lot of great things that have come out of this industry. But again, it's one of those things I think you had mentioned earlier, like if we want to talk about where I am today. I think a lot of tech workers today are asking themselves, okay, well, what's next? Because AI is starting to replace our jobs. And, a lot of very talented people who have very expensive college degrees are now looking at potentially getting laid off if they haven't already. They're worried about how are they going to stay relevant in an ever increasing AI focused job market. And again, it's one of those inflection points, I think, where you can really take a step back, or at least that's what I'm doing, and thinking to myself, okay, like this chapter has served its purpose, but what comes next, right? And how do we, both as individuals, but also as a society, like where do we go from here, right? So I think that's a really big underlying question at large.
Yeah, it is. But I do believe that right now, I think right now being March 2026, there has been a couple of months, and I know that there are lots of layoffs in the tech industry or in any industry actually because of AI. But as you know, I'm also, I mean, I'm still a publisher. I do magazines for enterprises, and it feels like this kind of print is coming back because and I think same for the high quality tasteful writing that we're talking about. When AI does it, there's just no soul to it. There's no emotion that comes out of it. So I think, I don't know, this is my own little take, but I think give it a little time. But I do believe that people like you and I will still have a creative say in this world. And I do believe that this will be very valuable.
I was just going to say, I think a great way to liken it is if we think about the Industrial Revolution and what it did for consumer goods, right? If anything, it's actually driven up demand for things that are handmade, artisan made products. And, some of the finest footwear in the world, the finest clothing in the world, these are things that are still handmade and are painstaking processes. But people are still willing to pay a premium for that, right? And again, I think this goes back to that sort of conversation we were having earlier about taste. That's the thing that AI yet cannot do. And AI is designed to please us ultimately, right? And taste or just that level of discernment rather to decide whether or not something is quality or not, or tasteful or not. that's this uniquely human trait that I think certainly people like you and I who have been heavily exposed to this world, we're a step further than I think a lot of other people who have relied very heavily on outsourcing their taste, right? I think trends are a really good example of this, especially today. If you look at how quick moving the trend landscape is, which is largely fueled by social media platforms like TikTok, it's not really focused on art, right? It's more focused on distraction. I saw this really interesting graph the other day that it was three different fish, and the smallest fish was art, the middle-sized fish was entertainment, and that was eating the art fish, and then distraction was the big fish that was eating them both. And I thought that really captured what's kind of happening today so well, because people can't even keep up with how lightning paced these things are happening, right? And if we take like the Labubu example, right, where everybody had a Labubu hanging from their Louis Vuitton purses or whatever it was, that isn't a signal of taste. That's a signal of, oh, you saw something that everybody else is doing and you got on board with that bandwagon. So AI is going to continue excelling at that, certainly, but being able to say, no, that's not it. That's the uniquely human thing.
I'm glad we both agree that the Labubus are not tasteful. But, so let me go back to this because so this tech job from San Francisco took you to London and now back to California, Northern California. I believe that there was a lot of growth that happened in all these moves. And I want to talk about this a little bit. And this podcast is called Rethink Your Life. And I think you, better than most people, would give me a really good definition of what rethinking your life means with the whole growth that goes with it. If you can share about this.
Yeah. So, we didn't really touch on this, but yes, my job has moved me back across the ocean and then back again. And my transition into the world of tech sort of coincided with the pandemic. And, I don't think there was any place in the world that was particularly wonderful to be in during COVID, but San Francisco was one of the first cities in the United States to shut down, and it was one of the last cities to really recover. And I was in my early 30s and I wanted to enjoy life to its fullest. And I had this sort of nostalgia towards my Berlin days of cosmopolitan lifestyle and dining out at the latest and greatest restaurants all the time and going dancing on the weekends. And so when I did have that opportunity to move to London, I thought, oh, this is going to be it. Like, this is the life I want. It's glamorous, it's luxurious, it's all the things. And, when I got there, just after COVID, things were still sort of in transition, I think, for myself, but also, I think just for the city as well. And I also had this like stark realization that, okay, I'm not going into an office 5 days a week anymore. And in your mid 30s, it's a lot more difficult to meet people than it used to be. So it was lonely, frankly. It was a very lonely experience being in London. And in addition, after having lived in California again for several years, there was this one day in particular where it was I think in the spring, and there was no rain in the forecast, and I said, okay, I'm going to ride my bike to the gym. And then as I'm riding my bike, just torrential downpour. I'm absolutely soaked. Thankfully, I had a change of clothes, but I did not have a change of socks with me. So I was walking around in the gym in London in wet socks and squeaking at every step and just thinking to myself, why am I doing this? This isn't what I want. So, ultimately my job actually asked me to move back to the States. And I was like, where do I sign? Like, I'm down. Just tell me where to be. So I did move back to California, but initially I went to Los Angeles. My family now lives in the greater LA area. It felt like a good fit, but my partner and I ultimately we just didn't end up loving the lifestyle there. And one of the things that kept coming into our minds was, you know what, we actually kind of want a slower pace of life. All these things that we thought were so glamorous and so exciting, like they just didn't have the same flair or allure to us. So we ended up moving up to Northern California, Northern Bay Area, and it's very quiet and peaceful here. It's just absolutely beautiful. I pinch myself sometimes, as somebody that loves to travel and I still love cities and the energy that they provide, but I kind of don't even want to go on vacation anywhere because I live in such a beautiful place. We literally have little deer who come and eat our flowers in the garden every weekend or every evening rather, and squirrels and birds. And it's a life that I never really would have imagined craving. But now that I have it, this is probably the first time in, probably over a decade that I'm feeling like, okay, this is actually a place that I can imagine growing roots in. I think to that point around rethinking your life, right? We tend to chase things that society tells us are the things that we should chase, be that career, be that where you want to live, be it the things you wear. And I've certainly been a contributor to all of that throughout my life, and heck, even my career, and to some extent has been focused on shaping culture in that way. But when you step outside of everything and you really start to ask yourself, hey, does this align with my values? Is this really what I want personally for me? Sometimes the answer might surprise you, and it might take you down a very different path than you originally anticipated. And I know, to flip it back on you for a little bit, this is something that you've gone through a lot in recent years as well. And I think again, it's part of that curiosity that I spoke about earlier, right? Where if you remain curious and open as well, right? Open to these new experiences, you might uncover things that you never expected, and they might surprise you for the better as well. And life might take you down a very different path than what you had originally envisioned for yourself.
But I think people have fear, a lot of fear. And, when people ask me, I mean, one day maybe I'll share my own story on this on this podcast, but a lot of people ask me all the time how I did it. And it's so hard to answer this question sometimes because I'm just like, it's hard for me to share that I don't have fear around trying new things. And I think trying the small things will just compound into eliminating the fear. I mean, in the last 6 years, you crossed the ocean 3 times, and, you moved houses so many times, and you always very gracefully get into a new job and a position and mindset and, the whole knowledge and expertise that go with the new positions, and I think this is really, I mean, yeah, the curiosity, but really trying to eliminate fear, and I think this is where mindset is so important. Just, I mean, the best tip I can give anyone is learn to control your thoughts. If you're thinking about all the worst things that can happen, train your brain to think about all the great things that can happen out of this. It's obviously not easy to do it when you've done it multiple times, but surround yourself with people who can support you in doing that. And I think this is also such an important component. You've had a lot of great friends, I guess, around you who supported you in all your choices.
Yeah, I mean, certainly 100%. And, and I'll be remiss to say that, if you travel the world as much as both of us do, if you move places a lot, it's really hard to build community when you're in this constant state of impermanence. Um, but I think to go back to something you were saying about this fear, right? Or this idea that, oh, it's too much to take on. A really great example is for this that I think might be quite relatable to a lot of people is the idea of physical fitness, right? Where a lot of people, they look at a gym as an example and they find it intimidating. All these free weights and all the different machines, and they get overwhelmed. I mean, how many people have a gym membership that they never use, right? And I was like that for pretty much most of my 20s. And when I actually moved to San Francisco, I made a commitment to myself and I said, hey, I really want to get physically fit. I want to take care of my body. I want to make this a regular practice. So I hired a trainer. I hired an expert or a mentor, if you will, to help me understand what I need to do to support my goal and to help me achieve building up that routine. Um, and I think this is something that's broadly applicable to really anything in life, right? If you're interested in taking a pottery class, like you're not going to go in there and have just read a blog post and say, I'm a potter now. No, you have to have an expert who's going to help show you the ropes. And again, this kind of goes into that initiatory practice that I alluded to earlier, but it's also just, mentorship is, I think, one of the most important things that anybody can have in their personal and professional lives. And if you can't think of at least one mentor in your life, then I think, that's the first thing that you should make a priority. Find somebody who is smarter than you and knows how to do something that you don't so that you can learn how to do that thing that they do so well. And everybody will put their own unique flavor on, whatever that is, be it physical fitness, be it cooking, be it pottery, be it a career, you have to keep it uniquely yours, but find somebody who's better than you are that you can get guidance from. And when it comes to friendships, for example, I put a lot of emphasis on surrounding myself with people that I find inspiring and people that I find to help fuel me creatively, right? I think it's really important that when you have a friendship group, my grandmother used to say this thing, tell me who your three best friends are, and I'll tell you who you are. And I think every culture has some version of this saying, right? But cultivate community with people who you find inspiring and people that can teach you things that you don't know. And be ruthless about that, right? Cut people out of your life who are toxic, who are energy vampires. Those are not the people who are going to help you in life. You want to surround yourself with the people who add fuel to your fire.
Absolutely. I see more and more people now talking about friendships because they keep saying, there has been so many books about love or careers, but we were never taught how to approach friendship or how to do friendship well or how to break up a friendship. There's more talks about that, and I'm really excited for it because it is really important. I mean, I know that I've had seasons with lots of people, and I'm grateful to have people who just keep growing at the same pace. It's an important topic that I don't think we talk about enough. So Nick, I mean, I could continue this forever, but I think we're gonna slowly start closing the conversation. So I want to ask you what you're working on now. What are you building now? Because I know that you are exploring a new project. It's not totally defined yet, but I do want to hear about it.
Yeah. So I think actually the fact that it's not defined is literally part of the brand, if you will. So, you know, at heart, more than anything, I am really passionate about creative work and creative expression. And, certainly in my day job, climbing a corporate ladder, I don't always get to be as creative as I'd like to be. So I just recently launched a website called Liminal Standard. And, this idea of liminality, the space in between, if you will, I think that's kind of exactly where my life has been at so many different points, right? This transitionary state. So this is basically an outlet right now for me to sort of document my experience along the way, to share my story, and hopefully in the future share the story of others who have found themselves in similar points of their lives. So yeah, it's very, very fresh, very new. I think I literally launched my first post a couple of weeks ago. But yeah, if folks are interested in hearing more, liminalstandard.com, and you can read up on more.
Did you post more since your first post?
Not yet, not yet. In progress, coming this week.
I do want to remind anyone listening that you are a beautiful writer, and I really encourage people to go and read your first post because I think it's everything you need to know about the difference between AI writing and an actual expert in writing. So, for anyone listening right now who's feeling in between, whatever that means, I'm not sure if they feel like quitting or if they feel stuck, what would you tell them?
I think it's exactly just looking for opportunities to continue to grow and develop. Let's say you're in your job and you're not feeling super fulfilled. You don't have to necessarily change jobs in order to find some fulfillment, right? You can get fulfillment outside of your career. Volunteer, take a creative class, do something away from work. I think, especially today, so many people identify themselves with their work, and we're starting to see, the effects of that on people, high degrees of burnout. And, if people end up losing their jobs due to layoffs or, for whatever reason, um, people are really struggling to land back on their feet. And continue to stay curious, continue to stay open, and say yes to opportunity when it arises, right? Uh, I think you mentioned earlier, it's really hard to describe to people what it's like to go through all these changes and transitions. And I think such a critical part of that is just saying yes when an opportunity arises, and overcoming that fear. Of course, there's always going to be discomfort, right? But by being open to opportunity, by keeping your eyes open, I think that's some people might call that manifestation, but for me, I think a lot of my life has been being in the right place at the right time, and then saying yes when those opportunities do arise.
Beautiful. I cannot wait for part two when your platform, forms into whatever it forms into, and we'll talk about that. But for now, I wanted to just thank you so much for sharing, Nick. This was very inspiring.
Of course, thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure catching up.
Thank you.